if reform get quite close in Runcorn, I think that's going to send shivers down some spines. Welcome back to the Division Bell. I'm Lizzy.
I'm Christian.
We're back after a 2-week break and we'll be discussing the local elections, the Supreme Court gender ruling and whether the Pope has a place in politics.
Not only are we back, Parliament is back from its Easter recess. We had our first PMQs yesterday and thankfully for once it was rather spicy.
It was one of the punchiest exchanges I've ever seen between Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer. They were really swinging for each other. I mean, you can tell the sort of wider context is obviously there's the local elections next week, so everybody's feeling very political. But obviously the main thing on the table was the Supreme Court's ruling last week around, which basically found that in law the term woman refers to biological sex. Now, this has been an incredibly fraught question for a number of years, and it was a big moment last week. And I think Kemi Badenoch for once decided to use all of her PMQ questions on one subject. She sometimes jumps around and, but this time she really wanted to stick on this because this is an issue that the Tories have been really into for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost sort of her defining issue. It's always been her niche, her best selling point is that she is a ethnic minority right-wing woman who is willing to dive into culture war issues with both feet. We had her at PMQs yesterday. Undoubtedly, I think her strongest performance in the job so far. And she obviously also kicked the bruise with Keir Starmer of Rosie Duffield, which is a particular sore point. Rosie Duffield being the former Labour MP for Canterbury, who is massive on the trans/women's rights issue, and she quit the Labour Party last year. I think it was
on the eve of Conservative conference.
Oh, that was it.
Yeah.
Yes. She's not yet joined the Conservative Party, and actually I don't think she will. But there's this sort of cross-party coalition between her and Kemi Badenoch. They seem to be patting each other on the back for a job well done over the past week.
Yeah, I think that the Kemi Badenoch clearly felt that the Supreme Court ruling had vindicated the stance that she has taken for a long time. And I think she used it, she decided, fairly to try and really hone in on the tensions within the Labour Party on this issue, because Labour, as you say, Rosie Duffield found herself kind of on the outs of the party because of this stance. It wasn't where the leadership was. This has shifted, but there are real tensions within Labour about the handling of trans rights, how you protect women-only spaces. And, I mean, their response, I think it took the government quite a long time to come out with anything more than a statement sort of responding to the judgment. I mean, Keir Starmer's first comments on it were on Tuesday.
To be fair, he was on holiday.
He was on holiday
when the ruling dropped.
Yeah, he was on holiday, which is fair enough. But, I think Rachel Reeves last week welcomed the clarity of the judgment. And then over the weekend and at the start of this week, ministers keep welcoming the clarity of the judgment, which actually is quite unclear still. I think obviously the comments from the Supreme Court justices were clear about what it means, but organisations are now scrambling to try and decide how to interpret it.
Keir Starmer's saying that the Supreme Court ruling has given clarity, and it has on a legal basis, but then there's the whole sort of bottomless pit of questions about implementation for private businesses. If you're a women's refuge, do you have to ban trans women from entering, or is it voluntary? How does that work? Are shops and cafes ordered to have separate men and women bathrooms, for example? So there's a lot to do, and I think we're waiting for further guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. But what the ruling hasn't done is given clarity to the Labour Party. It's certainly been somewhat destabilising. We saw on Sunday, the Mail on Sunday had a splash regarding leaked messages of some ministers including Chris Bryant, who were criticising the Equality and Human Rights Commission's response to the ruling, implying like they wanted to challenge the Supreme Court's decision. And clearly the party is completely split between the sort of traditional Labour wing and the more progressives who still remain solidly in line with the trans movement and are quite upset by the whole row.
Yeah, well, I think actually those messages were presented in the Mail on Sunday as if it was some sort of extraordinary thing, whereas actually it was a group of ministers, of MPs, who are interested in or involved in the LGBT community. So of course they would have an opinion on the protection of trans people. It is so difficult to make good policy on this issue. Tensions are so high on both sides and have been rising for a number of years. I mean, I would never doubt the kind of good faith of a lot of the women who've been campaigning for this. But I would say that in my nearly 9 years reporting from Westminster, the political centre on this issue has shifted dramatically.
It's been all over the place.
But in 2017, when I first started reporting from Westminster, the Conservatives were talking about making it easier to change your gender. And that was the position under Theresa May. And then under Boris Johnson, and certainly under Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, it was identified as a wedge issue that was pushed and pushed and pushed. And I'm not saying by any stretch that everybody involved in that side of the debate has bad motives for any reason. There are really serious and significant issues with women's safety and making sure protecting single-sex spaces. But I know that I had conversations with Downing Street advisors, certainly under Boris Johnson, who saw trans issues as part of a culture war that they could push. And you can see from 2017, where it was something that wasn't really talked about that much in the mainstream, it is now one of the most fraught issues in this country. And I still think the amount of airtime it gets is disproportionate. I can understand why trans people don't necessarily want to be interviewed on this issue. I get that must be very difficult to go on the radio, go on TV and have people ask questions about whether you have a right to be who you want to be. That must be a very, very difficult thing to do. But it does mean that side of the debate is not always well represented. And so I think you get this conversation that becomes so toxic and it's only the extremes from both sides. And I actually thought Keir Starmer was right to say in PMQs yesterday that we just need to lower the temperature on this.
I suppose the problem is that legally you can't quite have the nuance that I think the majority of Brits would want. Now, I think if you polled, the Supreme Court's decision would be very popular. But I also think there's a very different level of intensity and feeling between, for example, trans women in women-only prisons and in rape crisis centres versus other areas like public bathrooms and changing rooms. Boris, regardless of what you think of him, actually politically on cultural issues was pretty liberal. It's
quite liberal, yeah.
And didn't want to be Prime Minister during such a fraught time. You saw the same thing with the Black Lives Matter protest. It wasn't until they started smashing up statues that he really came out against the movement. And with Boris, you got the sense that he was being dragged along by advisors like Dougie Smith and Munira Mirza, who were much more invested and saw the political. It wasn't. I mean, I do believe that they really care about it. I think it's not as cynical as you may think. It's just an election issue. They really do care about protecting women's spaces. But zooming back, the debate is really fraught, I believe, because throughout the history of progressive rights, you've not had situations where giving extra rights to people has taken rights away from other people, right? So gay marriage did not take away from straight marriage. The right of, the right of women to vote didn't take away from the right of men to vote. The problem with the trans debate, or the issue of whether trans women should be in women's changing rooms, is the people on both sides really, really do feel and have a case to make that increasing rights for one side decreases the safety of those on the other. And that's why this debate, amongst all the other debates about gay marriage, women's rights, and other things like abortion, or this is so fraught because the liberal movement has not had to contend with that problem before.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And one of the things I find really difficult listening to it is the idea also is you think if you're a newspaper or a politician, you want to protect the most vulnerable. We always say, you punch up, not down. But who is the most vulnerable in these moments? I mean, I believe personally that trans people are very vulnerable and they're a small group of people, but there are also vulnerable women who were born biologically as women in spaces like rape crisis centres who also need protection, and it's really hard to square those things. I do feel, though, as well, that yes, it's not all cynical, but, and I think this point was made by Bridget Phillipson and Keir Starmer, there's a lot of people out there saying, that we, on that side of the debate from the Conservatives, saying, we are protecting women. There are so many issues that affect women beyond kind of whether a trans person is using a space that they're in. Violence against women and girls is vastly predominantly committed by men who were born men and live as men. So I personally feel much more concerned and have had much greater experience of men who live as men and were born as men being a threat to me than I've ever felt from a trans woman. And I think sometimes that gets lost in this space, that the idea that this is the only thing that women need protecting from. Speaking of PMQs, one of the people who was notably not there was the Conservative Robert Jenrick, who has had an interesting week. Do you want to take us through it?
He has. So in the last week, he's emerged a few times in the headlines. Firstly, for something that involved me, actually, which is when he set up this accidental WhatsApp group, which he and his team say was actually to promote the fact he's doing the London Marathon for a very worthy charity. But obviously, given the constant debate around him maybe being on leadership manoeuvres, didn't help. Zia Youssef, the Reform chairman, described it as a saboteurs plotter group, which actually I'm sure that if Jenrick was doing that, he wouldn't have included half the lobby.
I was going to say, so over the top.
Dozens of journalists. At one point, Nadine Dorris, I saw, was typing a message and then she stopped, which was a shame. I was hoping she'd get involved. And then we also had Sky News get a recording of him at a private dinner in March, sort of alluding to the fact that whilst he agrees with Kemi Badenoch that they've got the Tories have to destroy reform, sort of hinting that maybe if that doesn't happen by the election, then it doesn't make sense to have the two parties eating each other's vote share and allowing Keir Starmer to sneak through the middle into a second term. Now, his team have denied that's what he was saying. He was actually talking about voters needing to unite voters, not the parties. I'm not so sure, because
I think that's a bit of a dodgy explanation.
I think Jenrick gets this, and he's right to say that there's no point having a split right-wing vote in this country and allowing Starmer to win by default. He can't do anything at the moment without being accused of plotting.
Probably because all the things he's doing, he strays beyond his brief so much. But I do think that, I mean, if she doesn't want to do a lot of media,
which she doesn't,
and so I suppose it's a good thing to have people like Robert Jenrick or Chris Philp, who we had on this podcast, who does a lot of media, doing that work for her. And maybe she thinks that allowing Jenrick a bit of a sort of free rein is a good thing because it keeps him in the tent rather than on the backbenches being annoying to her.
The main criticism actually isn't about Kemi, it's about the rest of the shadow cabinet. I was at a lunch yesterday with a lot of Westminster insiders on the right, And at one point, we were actually sort of having a game of, can you name the Shadow Health Secretary? Can you name the Shadow Environment Secretary? And
I'm having a panic. My brain has gone.
Do you know the Shadow Health
My
Secretary?
brain is actually gone.
It's not even.
Who is the Shadow Environment Secretary?
As Vicky Atkins.
Okay.
But that's
I did know that. I did know
she's
that.
been slightly more more vocal, but certainly on topics like climate, education, healthcare. The Tories aren't really talking about them.
Well, they haven't got any policy. I've got nothing.
Well, that's a fair point.
Problem.
Next Thursday is the big day itself.
The big
day itself. I mean, it is like, it's not quite Christmas for us. It's certainly an Easter weekend, right? Mm-hmm. for political journalists, 1,600 council seats up for election will have big implications across the board. Tell us what we think is going to happen.
It's the first proper electoral test for the Labour government since they won the general election. These seats were last contested in 2021, so Boris Johnson was really
popular.
Yeah,
let's be honest.
Yeah, it was one of his best periods. The COVID vaccine had been approved. The Tories were soaring in the polls because everyone was so delighted.
That's when they won the Hartlepool by-election as well.
Exactly.
I mean, it was mad.
So it was a really good night for them, and it was a terrible night for Labour. It was one of the lowest points of Starmer's leadership, and actually we now know that he thought about resigning because they had a really bad night and they lost this critical by-election. So that kind of means that this time around the Tories are the ones with the most to lose. So Lord Hayward, the Conservative peer, who's a polling expert and does a lot of work on local elections, his kind of predictions that he sent around to us last night were that the Tories would get sort of up to 425 councillors, which would mean them losing sort of 500 plus, which is pretty grim. Yeah. Mostly to Reform and also the Lib Dems, who always perform pretty well in the local elections. They're very organised on the ground. And Reform were obviously not a part of this picture really in 2021. So they're suddenly in there messing up the whole thing. Yeah. Labour have fewer seats to defend. So his prediction was that they'd get about 280. That might mean sort of losing about 25, which is not too bad. But his sort of analysis was that because of the kind of unpopularity of the government in the polls more generally, and the rise of Reform, they're unlikely to take council seats in places in the Midlands and the North, which in other circumstances they might have been winning. So that's bad for Labour. And then Reform could get up to 450 councillors, which obviously is a great night for Nigel Farage. So I think the big story of the night is going to be how Reform do. And obviously we're expecting the Tories to be the big losers from that. But the Greens also could always do quite well on a local, a local election. They exist. And so the Greens and the Lib Dems are going to be picking up seats, Labour probably sitting where they are, and the Tories are going to have a bloodbath.
Are you brave enough to make a prediction about the Runcorn by-election?
Oh, I don't think so. Too close to call. I mean, I think that it's hard to say. I mean, at the moment, from the conversations I've been having, it sounds like Labour will hopefully clinch it, but Reform have absolutely thrown the kitchen sink at it, and they are doing well in that area. And there are some quite complicated. There's obviously quite a lot of factors at play there, but there is a side story that is relevant here about Hillsborough. Yeah. So the Prime Minister promised that he would bring in this Hillsborough law. He made the promise at Labour conference in Liverpool in September, and it would impose a duty of candour on public officials to try and prevent state cover-ups of that kind. And he promised it would be brought forward in time for the anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, which was on April 15th. And the government, we wrote some stories about it in the run-up, that the government basically accepted they were going to miss that deadline. That is a big issue in Liverpool, in Merseyside, and Runcorn is not very far away. There are a lot of Liverpool supporters there, and a few people I've spoken to on the ground say that there's a lot of hurt and anger about the fact that they feel that they're possibly about to be betrayed.
I would expect Labour to hold it by like 1,000 votes. But, as Nigel Farage keeps telling us, this is Labour's 16th, 17th safest seat in the country. So if we're getting to that level of closeness by reform, almost every Labour MP in the country is going to wake up terrified, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was already a nervousness about reform because there are a large number of Labour seats that were won where reform came second in what we used to call the Red Wall that Boris Johnson smashed and then was rebuilt at this election of Labour heartland seats in the North and the Midlands. Also, places where our mirror readers are, these are places that often decide elections, and reform did really well in a lot of those places. So I think a lot of Labour MPs are already very worried about that. And if reform get quite close in Runcorn, I think that's going to send shivers down some spines. Okay, so our statement of the week, another one of the big stories that's come up, is should the Pope be involved in politics?
It would be incredibly difficult for any religious leader to not get involved in politics, given so much of politics is about issues of morality and ethics, and also how do we best help the poor and the meek and mild, as the Christians would say. I suppose my problem with the Pope that's just died is that I seriously disagreed with a lot of his political views because he did stray. I would go beyond the high level credence of, we must do our best to help the poor. He strayed into policy debates, and I think about he was pretty anti-capitalism. I mean, he was basically the most left-wing pope we've ever had, and I would say, as a free marketeer, the sort of places that he is from in South America, they will be brought out of poverty by free trade and globalization and a liberalization of their market, not by having a chip on their shoulder about how wealthy America is.
There's not a lot in the Bible about free trade, as far as I can recall.
No, and Jesus actually smashed up a market stall. So actually, it compares.
There's a lot in there about
basically a preamble to Mao's Little Red Book economically. When you start straying into the sort of political debate you could have on Question Time about how do you best actually raise people up from poverty, and he starts coming out with policy suggestions that I happen to believe are quite wrong and would actually worsen poverty, then you get into a position where I think actually he should probably have stepped back from that debate.
But isn't that part of the point, that it's a debate, that he's bringing something forward, he's changing, he's creating a conversation, that's part of that responsibility?
I suppose it's the same thing as whether a politician or a celebrity should have an opinion. It's all very well, for example, for the Archbishop of Canterbury to be really open and generous towards illegal migrants coming across on small boats, but then it's quite easy to be generous and open when you live in Lambeth Palace and you don't live, in the left behind areas of the north of England where you see the effects of illegal immigration and, people trafficking and crime and the difficulty in getting jobs and wage compression. So,
but not all of that.
Some of these people fine have an opinion, but also question whether your voice is actually helpful and whether it's coming from a place of expertise or just, I quite like to be nice to people.
We can have a go at the Archbishop of Canterbury for living in Lambeth Palace, but the Prime Minister was always banging on about it, and he lives in Downing Street.
It's fair enough, although Downing Street is a pokey little flat, isn't it? Thank you very much for watching The Division Bell. As ever, please do like, subscribe, follow us on social media at Daily_Express and at Mirror Politics. Please do join us again next week for another episode.